Chapter 5, Part C of Greener Than You Think. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Greener Than You Think by Ward Moore. Chapter 5, Part C. The world took the extension of the grass to South America with a philosophic calm which can only be described as amazing. Even the Latins themselves seemed more concerned with how the grass had jumped the gap than with the impending fate of their continent. The generally accepted theory was that it had somehow mysteriously come by way of the West Indies, although as yet the grass had not appeared on any of those islands, and even Cuba, within sight of the submerged Florida Keys, was apparently safe behind her protective supercyclone fans. But the fact the grass had appeared first at Medellin in Colombia rather than in the tiny bit of Panama remaining seemed to show it had not come directly from the dagger-pointed mass poised above the continent. La Prensa of Buenos Aires said in a long editorial entitled, "Does Humanity Betray Itself?" When the Colossus of the North was evilly enchanted, many Americans, except possibly our friends across the River Plate, breathed more easily. Now it would seem their rejoicing was premature, and the doom of the Yankee is also to be the doom of our older civilization. How did this verdant disease spread from one continent to another? That is the question which tortures every human heart from the Antarctic to the Caribbean. It is believed the cordon around North America has not been generally respected. Scientists with the noblest motives and adventurers, urged on by the basest, are alike believed to have visited the forbidden continent. It may well be that on one of these trips the seeds of the gigantic Cynodon dactylon were brought back. It is well known that the agents of a certain Yankee capitalist have been accustomed to taking off on mysterious journeys near the very spot now afflicted by the Emerald Plague. It was a dastardly hint, and the sort of thing I had long come to look upon as inseparable from my position. Of all peoples, the Latin Americans have long been known as the most notoriously ungrateful for the work we did in developing their countries. Why, in some backwards parts, the natives have been content to live by hunting and fishing, till we furnished them with employment, and paid them enough so they could buy salt fish and canned meats. Fortunately, La Prensa's innuendo, so obviously inspired by envy, was not taken up, and attention soon turned from the insoluble problem of bridging the gap to the southward progress of the weed itself. From the very first, everyone took for granted the victory of the grass. No concerted efforts were made either to confine or to destroy it. The World Congress to combat the grass, far from being inactive, worked heroically, but it got little cooperation from the peoples most closely affected. When at one time it seemed as though the Congress had got hold of a possible weapon, the Venezuelans refused them the necessary sites, and Brazil would not allow passage of foreign soldiers over its soil. Nationalism suddenly became rampant. "We will die as Ecuadorians, descendants of the Incas," exclaimed the leading newspaper of Quito. El Gaucho of Lima pointed out caustically that most of Ecuador's area really belonged to Peru, and the Peruvians were the true descendants of the Incas anyway. "We shall all die as unashamed Peruvians," thundered El Gaucho. In vain the Church pointed out the difference between Christian resignation and sinful suicide. The reply of most South Americans, when they bothered to reply at all, was either that the coming of the grass expressed God's will toward them, or else to scorn the Church entirely. Imitations of Brother Paul's movement flourished, with additions and refinements suited to the Latin temperament. So the efforts of the World Congress were almost entirely limited to searching each ship, plane, and individual, leaving the doomed continent to be sure none of the fatal seeds were transported. Even this precaution was resented as an infringement on national sovereignty, but the resentment was limited to bellicose pronouncements in the newspapers. The republics looked on sullenly while their honor was systematically violated by phlegmatic inspectors. The grass grew to unheard of heights in the tropical valley of the Amazon. It washed the slopes of the Andes as it had the Cordilleras and the Rockies, leaving only the highest peaks free of its presence. It raced across the llanos, the savannas, and the pampas, and covered the high plateaus in a slow, relentless growth. The people ran from the grass, not in a straight line from north to south, but by indirection, seeking first the sea-coasts and then escape from the afflicted land. Those North Americans who had eluded the grass once did not satisfy themselves with half measures when their sanctuary was lost, but bought passage on any bottom capable, however dubiously, of keeping out the sea, and embarked for the farthest regions. In point of time, I am now about halfway through my narrative. It is hard to believe that only 11 years have passed since the grass conquered South America. Indeed, it is extraordinarily difficult for me to reconstruct these middle years at all. Not because they were hard or unpleasant. On the contrary, they carried me from one success to another, but because they have, in memory, the dreamlike quality of unreality, elusive, vague, and tantalizing. Like a dream, too, was the actual progress of the grass. We were all, I think, impressed by the sense of repetition, of a scene enacted over and over again. It was this quality which gives my story, now that I look back upon it, a certain distortion. For no one hearing it for the first time, and not as any reader of these words must be, thoroughly familiar with the events, could believe in the efforts made to combat the grass. These efforts existed. We did not yield without struggles. We fought for South America as we had fought for North America. But it was a nightmare fight. Our endeavors seem retrospectively those of the paralyzed. The grass gripped the continent's great northern bulge, squeezed it into submission, and worked its way southward to the slender tip, driving the inhabitants before it, duplicating previous acts by sending an influx from sparsely to thickly settled areas, creating despair, terror, disruption, and confusion, pestilence, hysteria, and famine. The drama was not played through in one act, but many. To a world waiting the conclusion, it dragged on through interminable months and years, offering no change, no sudden twists of fortune, no elusive hopes. At last, mercifully, the tragedy ended. The green curtain came down and covered the continent to the Strait of Magellan. The grass looked wistfully across at Tierra del Fuego, the land of ice and fire, but even its veracity balked, momentarily at any rate, at the inhospitable island, and left it to whatever refugees chose its shores as a slower, but still certain, death. South America finally gone, the rest of the globe breathed easier. It would be a slander on humanity to say there was actual rejoicing when the World Congress sealed off this continent too, but whatever sorrow was felt for its loss was balanced by the feeling that at long last the peril of the grass was finally ended. No longer would speculative Germans, thoughtful Chinese, or wakeful Englishmen wonder if the super cyclone fans were indeed an effective barrier. No longer would Cubans, Colombians, or Venezuelans look northward apprehensively. Oceanic barriers now confined the peril, and though the world was shrunken and hurt, it was yet alive. More, it was free from fear for the first time since the mutated seeds had blown over the salt band. I must not give the impression that a wiping off of the grass from the account books of humanity was universal and complete. The World Congress periodically considered proposals for countermeasures. On the top of Mount Whitney, Miss Frances still labored. New assistants were flown to her as the old ones wandered down the great rock slide from the old stone weather house off into the grass during fits of despondency, went mad from the realization that, except for problematical survivors on the polar caps, they were alone in an abandoned hemisphere, or died of simple homesickness. In the research laboratories of Consolidated Pemmican, formulas for utilizing the grass were still tinkered with, and the death of almost every public-spirited man of fortune revealed a will containing bequests to aid those seeking means of controlling the weed. It is